Checkout tracking by the NPD Group brings you a receipt collecting system that gathers data anonymously through technology we created, providing your businesses with answers.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction. So I had I'd initially asked her to provide a smoke machine and some music and a disco ball, but apparently that got lost in translation. So I feel like I'm giving an infomercial up here with this thing. So good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending the session today. We're going to talk a lot about engagement today, and I know it's been a recurring theme throughout the conference and for a lot of more recent mobile conferences. And so I'm going to highlight a lot of the research that we've done over the last 6 months, and I'll talk about the methodology of how we've got to that. But first and foremost, I just want to talk about and kind of level set so we're all kind of speaking the same thing. So when we look at this data, and we're literally looking at hundreds of millions of transactions and tons of event level data across a lot of our gaming clients globally. So a lot of the research is going to come from that, and it's going to be global in nature, so it's not US specific. But as we look at, just generally speaking, the app stores, about 20% of active apps in the app stores, as you guys know right now, are mobile games. And that represents about twice as much as the next category in the app stores. So as you guys know, you guys are in the right market. Mobile gaming is just taking off. It's really booming right now. And that 20% represents about 400,000 active games. So by the nature of what you guys are doing, it's a super highly competitive market. All right, so let's get into it. So typically what we're talking about here as casual gamers are, how can we acquire as many users as possible? How can we get those users to stay active within our apps for as long as possible, and then transition to the next app or the next game in our portfolio? It could be looking at, who are our greatest spenders and how do we keep them happy and how do we find more of those types of folks? So that's kind of the recurring theme for what we're going to be looking at today. But what we're doing is we're the guys who are tracking when somebody clicks on an ad, gets to the app store, downloads the app, and does anything post-install. We're the guys who are tracking all of that activity and helping you understand media effectiveness. So where are our dollars best being spent? Where are we acquiring the right types of users that are actively engaged in the app itself? And how do we create lookalikes so we can go find more of those types of users itself? So that's the kind of the level set. That's the technology view that we're coming from when we share all of this data today. Just to give you guys an idea of some of the competitiveness of the field itself, we're regularly recognized as leaders in this space, and 3 independent sources have said so. I'm not going to leave this slide up here. I'm going to leave a lot of slides on the screen for a while because there's some great data. You guys feel free to take photos of it, and I'm happy to share this afterwards. So the challenge that we have right now, and this photo itself went really viral in APAC recently. It was huge. So the problem is we have no room to breathe, right? There's so much competition to get attention and exposure to our users itself. And as we look at that, just in the app store specifically, there's 1.5 million apps in Android, 1.4 in iOS. And it's not only that there's a great amount of variety and options for users to get into, but specifically when we look at user behavior of apps themselves, 90% of people are going to use maybe 10 apps, and that's it. So now you're competing for attention span across across a number of very, very popular apps. So ideally, in a perfect scenario, this would be, if this was possible, this would be great. We'd have ours front and center, and everyone by default click on that. But we all know that's not. So it is possible. Things we can do, and hopefully some of the learnings you'll take away from today are how can we improve retention? How can we grow lifetime value of our users that we've spent a lot of time and energy acquiring? And so I'm going to go into that. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about a recent study that we're putting out, and we're going to actually be posting this in about a month. So I'll be giving you guys a sneak preview of that today, and I'm going to talk about some of the top line data that we pulled out of that. But feel free to come up to me afterwards. I'm happy to share the report before we actually publish that. So what we did was we looked about 2 to 3 months worth of data. This represented like hundreds of millions of installs that we were looking at, and we looked at apps that had at least 3,000 installs. So we want to kind of get a level set there of active apps that were representative of what we're talking about here today. And specifically, we looked at networks where we were tracking at least 10 customers from each of those networks. So we want to try to get a representative sample that would make sense for you guys today. So what we did was we basically took an average normalized retention strategy and approach. So what that means is we looked at average retention on day 1, day 7, day 30, and we normalized it. So what we want to do is we want to remove the outliers. So we didn't want outliers kind of impacting or skewing the data itself. So that's kind of the methodology of how we looked at this. And what I'm going to share is top retention across Android, iOS, and we're going to dive into a number of different angles, including operating systems, devices. I'm going to wrap this up with a couple tips that hopefully you can walk away from today and start applying to really increase retention. So I guess, just to start this whole conversation when we get into retention, and it's a well-known fact, and this is pervasive across gaming and retail and travel, but the challenge is that you spend so much time and energy acquiring new users, in fact, millions of dollars, countless hours, and the inevitable fact is that within 30 days, 80% of those users are going to go dormant. So how do we not front end, spend all our time on the front end getting people in the front door, but how do we keep those people active? How do we encourage them to come back to our app, and how do we extend the lifetime value of those customers? And that's really what we're going to talk about today. So first and foremost, when we look at just Android itself, and again, we're looking at a normalized view of this retention data across these different networks. And I'm not picking and choosing different networks to talk about. I'm not going to highlight anyone in specific. So I'm just sharing data that we've accumulated globally. So as far as normalized retention goes on Android specifically, Twitter is really leading the pack right now, followed by AppLovin, Facebook. Obviously, this makes sense when you look at some of those top three as programmatic's really becoming a key driver in all the different networks that are really starting to drive volume and success itself. But as we go down the list, we see partners like Vungle and Ad Colony. Obviously, video is a very powerful mechanism, as I think the last speaker just shared a lot of great stats about that. Video is very important. Then you start seeing companies like StartApp and ChartBoost, which obviously have a heavy gaming focus. So naturally, that makes a lot of sense. And that's Android specifically. When we look at the kind of the power ranking, and again, I'm going to leave these on the screen for a minute if you guys want to take photos of them. What we do with the gaming power ranking is not only are we looking at the same data, but we're also factoring in quality and scale into these particular metrics. So as we look at this, obviously Facebook's the behemoth, ChartBoost, great gaming specific network. But you start to see a lot of other companies popping on the scene, Supersonic, Ad Colony, messaging platforms like Line, which are huge in APAC, as most of you guys know, and that trend is continuing to grow and grow moving forward. Taking a look at iOS, very similar in terms of the partners that we're seeing as kind of the top retention networks, but slightly different. I mean, not necessarily the same order. So we're seeing companies like Grow Mobile and Mobi really starting to gain a lot of momentum on this side of the business in this particular vertical. So when we start looking at, we start dissecting this a little bit further, and we say, let's just look at organic versus paid installs. And what is the net impact on retention overall as it represents? What we see when we look at Android specifically is that obviously everyone understands the value of organic-driven installs. I mean, the intent is so clear and so strong that it makes sense that these types of users are going to be much more engaged at the front end. So day one, 190% greater than paid acquisition customers itself, and that starts to level off by day 30. You're still at almost a 2x rate of paid installs. So it starts to show the value of organic, and obviously organic can play off your paid strategies as well. Same story with iOS, nothing fundamentally different, slightly different numbers, 145% greater on day one versus 85% on day 30, but very, very similar concept. Where I think it really starts to get interesting, and again, I'm not going to come to any conclusions and tell you my narrative on why I think this is happening. You guys can come to your own conclusions on this, but when we look at head-to-head on retention from day 1 to day 30 of iOS versus Android specifically, what we see is that out of the gate, Android is very, very strong. On day 1, these users are 20% more engaged than they are typically on iOS on day 1 itself. But as you look at that after day 7, that number shifts almost 30% over to Apple, and then it continues to grow onto the iOS side as well. So, take from that what you will. It could be that games that have a life cycle of maybe 7 days fare better on Android, perhaps. Maybe more strategic, RPG or strategy level games that are a little bit more highly involved and engaged tend to do better on iOS. Again, I'm not gonna make any claims on what that is, but that's kind of the data itself. When we specifically look at video, what we did here is we looked at a number of different video networks. We divided the retention of the video networks versus all of the other networks that we took in this study itself. And what we found was, again, I've heard that sat in at least two sessions over the last 2 days where people were talking about the value of video and what that means and the level of quality that you're getting from video itself. Yes, it's a lot more expensive. I think I read this morning that Machine Zone spends like, and again, sorry Vungle, but they spend like $20 in CPI on, with Vungle specifically, smaller volume but much higher CPIs because the quality is there and it represents a monetization that's worth it for those guys. But it's pervasive and it's starting to show a trend overall. So videos, obviously, if you guys aren't using it right now, it's something that is certainly a key driver for very high quality users moving forward. We look at brand power rankings. Obviously, this is just for Android devices. But you start to see, Samsung, obviously Galaxy is a huge hit. And I think, LG and Sony. And then you start to see a lot of APAC-specific brands, Lenovo, Asus. Obviously, there's a lot of adoption over there. Android's a lot bigger in international markets, so that makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of information that gets a lot more granular on the device level information. I just want to show you some top level metrics today so you can get an idea. But we go into a lot more detail about specific operating system versions, devices by country, et cetera. So a lot of great information as you start to build out your strategies. Happy to share with you. When we look at Wi-Fi specifically, we look at users that were on Wi-Fi initially when they actually installed the game itself. What we found is that they deliver a lot of short-term value. So on day one, they're significantly more engaged. The thing about Wi-Fi is it starts off very heavily skewed, that you're going to get much more engagement from a user on day one out of Wi-Fi, but it starts to level off over time. But it makes sense, right? If you have a heavy application, a heavy game that takes a lot of space, users would obviously prefer to download on when they have a Wi-Fi connection. And I think that's just one of those things where it makes sense. So I know it's right after lunch, and I know that I've blasted through 15 slides of research. So I could literally go through 30 more slides if you guys want to, but I think what I'm going to do here is kind of save that for you guys can download the report. I can send it to you. But what I want to do is kind of shift gears, and I want to kind of take some of the data that we just learned and understood, and I want to apply that and kind of share some of what we consider best practices in driving engagement in the app experience itself. So how do we improve retention? There's really two ways we can do it. One is on the front end, advertising related. So which campaigns are we driving? Which networks and partners are we working with? On the back end, it's more about user experience, right? That's more product focused. How do we deliver the best user experience, reduce the most friction for getting users to play our games itself, apply the best practices in usability that we've learned over the last several years. That's not what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about advertising related specifically. And so the first thing that we want to do, and that hopefully all of you guys are doing, in fact, let me just stop there and just by a quick show of hands, how many of you guys right now are using a mobile measurement or attribution platform right now? Okay, so maybe a third of you guys. And just keep your hands raised. Are you guys actively looking at retention reports as a factor into what you guys are doing? Okay, so maybe like 4 or 5 of you. So this is a great opportunity to walk away from this saying, you know what, I'm going to go talk to my measurement partner today. I'm going to find out, how are they reporting on retention? How can I take advantage of that data? This is a screenshot from AppsFlyer specifically, but what we show you is retention over time by specific networks itself. So what you can see at a top level is, network 1 is really not driving a lot of quality past day 1, really. But network 2 and network 6 and network 8 might represent opportunities to shift budget and reallocate because they're driving users that are spending more time over a longer period of time in our app itself, and that represents a higher opportunity to monetize those users. So retention reports are really important. The next one is cohort reports. So in this example, what I did was I pulled average sessions per user as the cohort, and I looked at 4 different media networks that were driving activity. So we're looking at average sessions per user. So if you look at that top line, for example, the way you could look at this report is say, by day 14, we start to see a plateau effect on network 1. It's still driving positive returns and positive users that are spending a lot of time in the app itself, but perhaps maybe right before day 14, we might want to initiate a retargeting or re-engagement campaign on this particular network itself. Whereas if we look at, for example, the bottom one, it's still positive, it's net positive, so maybe drop it is a little bit harsh, but you might want to look at perhaps maybe you've plateaued or you've maxed out on their potential reach and there's not much more opportunity there, so it might be an opportunity to take that money and move it somewhere else that is actually delivering better performance. The third thing that I think is really important is making sure that you're tracking the level of granularity of data out of your app as possible. So you want to capture as many in-app events that you can, because one, it's in your best interest to understand at a granular level, what are users doing? Are they, the events that you might want to track that might be relevant here could be like a Facebook Connect. It could be like a tutorial complete or a level achieved, or maybe you're unlocking a character, or maybe it's an IAP, whatever it may be. By tracking all of this information, you can not only arm yourself with better insights as to what users are doing, but you can inform the networks and the partners you're working with to go find more users who are doing those types of things. So continuous optimization is obviously a key thing, but being enabled to do that by tracking as many events as possible is certainly something you want to be looking at. So if your measurement partner is charging you for events, that might be an opportunity to go renegotiate a contract with those guys, because you certainly shouldn't be. Omnichannel tracking. So I know this is going to be relevant for some of you and maybe not so much for others, but what we mean here is that consumers are touching you in a number of different ways, whether it's desktop or whether it's mobile. I'm getting the 1 minute flag, so I'm going to speed up. So the idea here is, let's look at a comprehensive picture. Let's capture all the data from the app experience. Let's tie that with web and potentially other channels, and let's get a complete picture as to what users are doing. So when we look at LTV of a network that's driving a particular user, we can actually comprehensively look at that across a number of different channels itself. And then the last thing is just deep linking. I'm not going to talk much more about this outside of this is just a user experience thing, right? So you would never, if you were Best Buy and you're somebody was doing a Google search and trying to get a Samsung TV, you wouldn't drive them to your homepage. You would point them specifically to a relevant TV page where that the intent was showing based off that search query. Same thing with deep linking. So we want to make sure that we're driving people into the right place in the app itself, so we can make sure we're adhering to that user experience itself. I know I talk really fast. I know it's after lunch, and we went through a lot of stuff. That's it for me. The last thing I would say is this mobile gaming guide is available at our booth today, so please feel free to stop by. It's a lot of research. We will be putting out our performance index for gaming, which I shared some of the top-level metrics over the next couple weeks. So please feel free to send me an email or stop by our booth, and we're happy to send you a preview of that before it comes out. And then lastly is just, we're doing a great session at 3:30. Our own Ben Rudman's going to be talking with a number of other attribution partners in a panel, so I highly recommend you come into that. And with that, I will just say thank you for your time, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Sunil.
Thank you.
Any questions? We still can take 1 or 2 questions.
You mentioned omni-channel tracking?
Yeah.
And what are you doing to kind of unite the mobile with you look like desktop type stuff?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So it's a really tough challenge that a lot of companies are trying to tackle. So what we're wanting to look at is, obviously on desktop you're leveraging a cookie, right? That's the primary mechanism for data collection at the user level. On app we're looking at a device ID. So how do we marry the two subsets? Typically we're using a logged in mechanism. So is a user logged in on desktop and mobile? If so, we can match the login IDs when they're hashed, and that's how we're typically doing that. Any other questions? Oh, this is going to be a good one.
In general, how do you think attribution standards are going to change on mobile, like regarding like multi-touch and like view through over the next year? How do you see that evolving?
Great question. So the question was, how do we see attribution trends morphing over time with advent of like multi-touch attribution, perhaps incorporating view through level of data? So right now the challenge is that not every partner and network shares with us the level of detail we need to do full apples to apples comparison. So we don't get impression level data from some networks. We don't get cost data. So that's going to limit us to the time being. So our business development team is aggressively working with our regulated ecosystem of partners to try to convince them to supply that, because it's in the best interest of the advertiser. But one thing that we did introduce this year is multi-touch attribution. So the idea is the market works right now on a last click basis. What was the last channel that drove that user to install the app? And let's give all credit to that last channel. As we know, users are exposed to a number of channels along the way. So how do we partially attribute or attribute a multi-touch attribution? It's something we do right now. So we are able to see channels that perhaps assisted along the path to conversion that didn't necessarily represent the last click, but were a heavy influencer. And so we can start to highlight that data so you can understand, hey, you know what? Instead of just purely measuring on a last click basis, perhaps we're identifying the fact that one channel is representing 25% of assists, but not necessarily driving the last click. So it gives you a little bit more information to arm yourself to say, you know what, that might be a strong influencer channel. We might want to keep some money in that channel. But certainly a great question, James, and we're working on that quite a bit these days.
Do you think payment is going to be on that multi-touch basis as well?
Do I think what?
Payment, like how we pay for installs?
It very much so could be. I don't think the industry's there yet. If I just look at a parallel to desktop, it took so long to convince big companies, big e-commerce companies to move off of last click. It was such an undertaking that only kind of those forward-thinking first movers have actually adopted kind of a different attribution model and can do it that way. Perhaps a couple years from now, I don't know. Great questions, though.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, Sunil. Thanks for the questions.
Thank you very much.
And